Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into an important topic that touches on billions of lives: access to affordable medicines. Joining me is Charles Gore, the Executive Director of the Medicines Patent Pool. The Medicines Patent Pool, or MPP, aims to increase access to and facilitate the development of life-saving medicines in low and middle-income countries. MPP does this innovatively through voluntary licensing, so that wherever people live, they will have access to effective treatments. Charles, it's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I'd love to start at the beginning, and we've all seen the fantastic results from MPP. You have facilitated literally access to billions of doses of treatment. Tell me about the model. How does MPP work?
So, in the early 2000s, one of the big pressing problems in global public health was access to affordable HIV drugs. And so Unitaid decided to set up an organization, the Medicines Patent Pool, with the idea that we would approach the big pharmaceutical companies who had patented medicines for HIV and ask them to give us a license for low and middle income countries where they really weren't selling any. And with that license, we could then approach generic manufacturers in particularly India at the time and China to produce low cost but still very high quality, same quality in fact, medicines that could then be sold affordably in low and middle income countries. And then because that worked, we were asked to expand our remit initially to hepatitis C and TB and then across health, because the idea is that everybody should have access to the latest good medicines no matter where they live.
So you've spoken about generic companies, but of course the originator companies, the original innovators, obviously have a very important role to play here. And I'd love to hear from you, what would be their interest? Like, what's in it for them in MPP's business model?
Exactly. So we're very dependent on the originator companies actually agreeing to give us licenses in the first place. And so there are various reasons why an originator company may want to do this. And partly, certainly initially, it was about public relations and also about corporate social responsibility. And clearly, if you're a company that's just developed a really wonderful drug, in principle, you want as many people to benefit from it as possible. However, what we found in talking to originator companies is this wasn't always enough to persuade them. And in particular, if they thought of it just as a giveaway, as a kind of corporate social responsibility response, this didn't always work with some of the business people within the company. And so with wonderful support from WIPO, as well as the Government of Canada, we released a report earlier this year that really talks about how this works as a business model for originator companies, as well as giving them good PR, good corporate social responsibility, and so on, by actually showing that there's value in this for the companies. We're not talking billions, but still, it's a business proposition, as well as one that does good, and particularly in the current environment where equity has become so central as a result of COVID in particular, that companies see that this is important, that equity should be very much on their radar at the moment.
You've mentioned that MPP was specifically set up to respond to HIV, TB, malaria, hepatitis, but the world in recent years has seen an epidemiological shift from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases. And when we talk about NCDs, we're talking, of course, about cancer, heart disease, obesity, cardiovascular. How is MPP's model shifting, or maybe I should ask you, is MPP's model shifting to begin to address some of these disease areas? And we know that I think it's 74% of mortality, so deaths worldwide, are now due to NCDs, and obviously most of these are coming from lower and middle income countries, which is exactly the demographics that you're targeting. How are you doing this to move, or I should say to include, both communicable and non-communicable diseases in your work?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. We realized that we needed to move into this area. But one of the differences between NCDs and diseases like HIV, TB, malaria is that there's no buyer like the Global Fund, or PEPFAR in the case of HIV as well, set up actually to ensure that there is uptake and demand. And so when we go to an originator company and say, you've got this wonderful cancer medicine that's patented at the moment, but you're not selling in these low and middle income countries, will you give us a license? They go, okay, but how are you going to ensure that actually it's going to reach the people who need it? Because at the moment the government is not buying, there's very few diagnostics, there are not enough doctors in the countries, etc., etc. So we're having to approach this differently and think about partnerships with organizations who address some of these other barriers to access. It's not just simply about price. Price is clearly an element and can be the thing that rules it out, but you've got to put everything else in place. So building partnerships with other organizations, and one of the ones that we've done in cancer is called the Access to Oncology Medicines, with a whole group of organizations, I think, including industry. I think there are like 35 now involved in this to try and answer these questions, to make sure that if we get a license, actually there will be uptake, they will be used, because there is no point having medicines, no matter how cheap they are, sitting in a warehouse.
You mentioned licenses, and obviously this is one of MPP's main tools. And I wanted to ask you, when we talk about originators investing mostly in the R&D, and so that's usually massive amounts of kind of sunk costs into developing a medicine. Then we talk about licensing it to a generic producer. There's, I think, kind of this false assumption that the generics aren't themselves innovating. And what I wanted to ask is, how does MPP handle that from a licensing perspective, additional improvements that a generic producer may make on top of an originator company's original drug or technology? How does MPP handle that?
Well, in the terms of our licenses, we generally have terms that allow the generic companies to innovate. And often this is very beneficial for the originators because they can be licensed back to the originators, so they will benefit from it. But to give you an example of the kind of origination that's happened, we had a license for tenofovir, a drug that works for both hepatitis B and for HIV, and also for another drug, dolutegravir, for HIV. And these were combined by our generic manufacturers with another off-patent drug to create a single pill with these 3 compounds in it. And that's not available anywhere outside low and middle income countries as a result of our license. So in some respects, and it's WHO recommended first-line treatment, in some respects you could say that people in low and middle income countries are possibly getting an even better regimen than people in high income countries. So this ability to innovate is really important. It may also be that our generic companies have the right to develop pediatric formulations that have not existed before. And again, this is really important because I'm always saying this, but when the preamble to the Sustainable Development Goals was written, and this aim of the world to leave no one behind, I'm sure that they thought about, I don't know, certain groups like migrants or indigenous people who tend to get left behind, often people who are socially excluded. I bet they didn't really think about children, and yet children are always left behind. And so being able to develop appropriate formulations for children, because children are not actually small adults, they're actually different, and you need to have things that are appropriate in terms of taste, in terms of the actual amount of the active ingredient and so on. Really important.
As a mother of a 9-year-old and 11-year-old, I can confirm that children are in fact definitely not small adults. And it's interesting that you bring up children, because that was my next question for you. I wanted to ask you how MPP has evolved. I'm sure that when you all started, I think it's, gosh, 12 years ago now?
14.
14, oh my, all right, so you're in your full-on adolescence. So I'm sure that when MPP started 14 years ago, between then and now, the model has evolved, because we've seen that IP has really been evolving quite a bit, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I'd like to ask you is, how has your model evolved? What have you kind of learned in the first 14 years, and how are you doing things differently? And would you even define patent pool differently now than at the very beginning?
I think we would not have called ourselves the medicines patent pool if we were starting now, since we don't only do medicines. It's not just patents, because now we're doing a lot of, or certainly hoping to, do more of tech transfer. And actually we don't do that much pooling, really. So it's not really the right title even, and that I think shows how things have changed over time. As I say, we are doing more tech transfer, so this is an important new area for us. Came about because of COVID and because WHO asked us to partner with them on setting up mRNA vaccine manufacturing in low and middle income countries where it didn't really exist. The idea, if COVID persisted, to be able to produce COVID vaccines, but if it didn't persist, to be ready for the next pandemic. So that's clearly one way that we've changed, and tech transfer will become more important as we start to license more complex molecules, because generic manufacturers may not have the know-how to produce some complicated monoclonal antibody, for example, and will need a tech transfer. And often for originators, it's one thing to give us a license on a patent, it's another to devote a lot of time to actually transferring technology. Also, we've had to think about how to, our model is based on this idea that it's win-win-win. We want it to be a win for the originators, we want it to be a win and therefore sustainable for the generic producers, and we want it to be a win for public health and for people who need the medicines. So one of the things that we've looked at is, could we have significant royalties? Typically when we're dealing particularly with the least developed countries, but even with lower middle income countries, they're not really in a position to pay large royalties, because you don't want the price to go up. You want it to be as affordable as possible. We do have royalties in a number of countries, but we've never really had high royalties that really are commercially interesting to an originator. And yet we did a license exactly on those terms. So the situation was that an originator had a drug and it wasn't selling in, it was actually 4 countries where the price that they could come down to was too much for the countries to pay. So by negotiating between the countries and the company, we arrived at a figure that with a royalty of a certain amount, it would still be commercially interesting but affordable for the countries. And so this is not something we've done before. And this is about, again, thinking, how do we make it a win for everyone? And the whole thing about our model is that it's incredibly adaptable. People tend to think, oh, you've just got this one license, it's the same all the time. It isn't. All our licenses tend to be different in one way or another. They may cover different geographies, they may have different royalty, whatever. So we can adapt to make it win-win. And I think that's the point. And we're going to have to keep on adapting. And it may be, for example, one of the things that we did for one of our licenses, it only covered sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas most of our licenses tend to cover about 100 or so low and middle income countries. So each time we've got to think, what does the originator need out of this? What do generics need out of this? And primarily, what does public health need out of this?
Absolutely. And I really like the way you highlighted well, you're alluding to my next question, which is essentially where do we need to go next? And you were recently selected as Time Magazine's top 100 most important health people, so I feel I can ask you this question. As we look forward to what's next, where do we need to go that's within your control? And if you had a magic wand, where do we need to go that maybe is not within your control, but in a perfect world, what would change to really improve access to medicine? So what can you yourself have impact on, and what in a perfect world would be different as we move forward?
That's a difficult question. So I think that it is extremely important with intellectual property that we balance access and innovation. They are both the kind of key fundamentals, in my view, on which intellectual property is based. And I think sometimes we have strayed a little bit too much towards innovation and not enough towards access. And it's just a question of balancing them. And to your earlier question about non-communicable diseases, we need to do more there. So I need to put more resources into persuading originator companies to give us licenses in NCDs. And the reason for this is we need to show that voluntary licensing can work across health, that it isn't niche, it isn't just certain areas like infectious diseases, it actually can work everywhere, and again, where everyone can benefit from this. So that's, I guess, what I need to do is to put, and I'm just in the middle at the moment discussing with my team and then with my board about our strategy from 26 to 30. And we're really looking at exactly this. And we're doing some fundraising at the moment so that we can put more resources into getting NCD licenses. And then what's beyond my control is the pharmaceutical companies really changing their perspective and seeing the advantages of voluntary licensing. So quite recently there was a license, I don't want to go into details or shame anyone or anything, but there was a license that we really wanted and we didn't get. And I believe that part of the reason for that was that investors still see a license to MPP as something of a giveaway rather than a real benefit to a company. And obviously, you know, companies think about their share price a lot, and they want to make sure that, you know, Wall Street is happy with what they're doing. So this value report that we did with the World Intellectual Property Organization is so important in getting that message out there. So again, this is something that we'll do a lot more of. I've been talking to a number of countries about getting their governments to facilitate meetings with the pharmaceutical industry to really present this case. But then it's about investors really taking this on board as well as companies. And that's really something that's a bit outside our control at the moment, is investors' attitude to voluntary licensing and seeing that this is a good thing in two ways. One, it helps with doing a good thing, and a lot of investors are now interested in that, in corporate social responsibility and so on, and ESG, etc. But also that it's of real dollar value to a company as well.
Charles, thank you so much for coming to our studio today. And I didn't mention, but you are my first in-person guest, and I can't think of anyone better.
Well, that's extremely kind of you. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Amy.
Powerful words and a vital mission. Charles, thank you for joining us today and for the incredible work you're doing. And thanks everyone for joining us for this discussion. I hope you've gained valuable insights into the power of technology and collaboration in helping to ensure that medicines reach everywhere they're needed. Stay tuned for more engaging conversations by subscribing to the WIPO channel for inspiring videos that showcase how innovation and creativity shape our world and our lives. Until next time, stay healthy and be well.